Morning, everybody. Where's my tea? Happy one more week till Christmas, and welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's deputy online political editor, Lizzie Buchan. Morning, Lizzie.
Morning.
It's obviously very festive in the Mirror's parliamentary office, where there's zero tinsel and absolutely no joy to all mankind, which it is the rest of the year as well, actually. Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. Those of you listening later on podcast, lay off the mince pies. We need to make them last a bit longer. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on a shocking investigation into trophy hunting of wild reindeer. And not just that, but from Europe's last surviving herd of wild reindeer. Lizzie, this is a holiday that's being offered for thousands of pounds by a Scottish firm, but it's happening in Norway, isn't it? Is there anything the government can do to stop things like this?
Yes, I mean, this is pretty grim, these pictures. Obviously, we've kind of been looking into this for a while. The Mirror's been campaigning for a long time against trophy hunting, against the import of souvenirs from hunters from abroad. The problem is it's quite difficult for the government to sort of ban stuff that's happening abroad. So, you know, these holidays obviously are being offered by a Scottish firm in Norway. There's very little information about kind of what is actually being offered, how much it costs, all that sort of thing. So we've been trying to sort of get to the bottom of this. The thing that the government has been trying to do is to ban the import of souvenirs from trophy hunting. So banning sort of, you know, antlers, heads of carcasses shot abroad. But the last attempt to do this, a private member's bill by a Conservative MP called Henry Smith, sort of got onto the agenda, but then was talked out in the Lords in September by peers. So the government has been promising to do this since, I think, 2019, but so far they've made no progress on it. So there's quite a lot of pressure from sort of across the political divide to really do something about this. But at the moment, the government is only saying, you know, they remain committed to preventing the import of these kinds of souvenirs, but they, you know, they're
doing anything about it.
Yeah,
they're so committed that they're doing absolutely nothing. And of course, if something gets talked out in the House of Lords, it can still go back to the Commons, and the Commons has primacy, and they can still pass it if the government really wants to, can't they?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that time can always be made and legislation can always be got through if the government wants to throw its weight behind it. But this bill was a private member's bill anyway, so it was brought by a backbench MP rather than the government. And that always means that it's less likely to get time, it's less likely to be prioritised. So, you know, if it has fallen at this point, it could always, you know, the government could today say, you know, we're going to do our own legislation about it, we're going to bring it in, but they don't seem to want to do that. So I think it was sort of easier in some ways for them to get a backbench MP to do it. But now that it's not really progressed, the onus is on the government to say, okay, we've promised to do this, we should get on with it.
Yeah, they can also say, if one of those commitments that they want to be seen to do but not actually have to do is to get one of your backbench MPs to do something that's probably going to fail anyway, but at least it makes you look good for a bit until the end of when it doesn't come to law and you don't look good anymore. What do you think, everybody? Do you think these kind of hunting trips are absolutely okay? Do you have any kind of an issue? I'll take my glasses off because it's reflecting the screen, confusing people. You know, there are lots of people who talk about how this puts money back into various economies. I don't think Norway is particularly poor and really needs the cash. Sir Ranulph Fiennes, who's quoted there in the piece, campaigns against trophy hunting, thinks the whole thing's utterly disgusting. But so here we find ourselves with a government that has promised to ban trophy hunting, a public which largely wants a ban, and yet there's still people making huge amounts of money. And a British person who decided to go on that hunting trip could bring their trophies back into the UK, stick it on their wall like the bloodthirsty twits they are, and whatever the likes of that guy might think about these things, the cash does not go into the local economy. It goes to the company offering the business, the trip usually. The meat doesn't really go into the local economy, and if it doesn't last very long. He isn't a macho man. He is a soft-bellied, soft-pawed, spoilt little brat who's had his hand held by a professional hunter to go and shoot something which has no prospect of ever fighting back. These are herbivores, for goodness sake. They're not predators. There's no risk that they're going to suddenly turn and kill you. And he's just been given the chance to shoot that. And there's a word for people like that, and it's bully, frankly. And Dennis says, hello, everyone from Western Australia. Send your trophy hunters down here. We'll send them into the outback with a spoon and see how long they last. Dennis, in Australia, you only need to send them into the back garden, mate. You might not last. I've seen what some of your spiders can do. Lizzie, do you think the next Labour government's going to ban trophy hunting?
Unclear. It's not something that they've sort of talked a lot about. I mean, I would suspect that it's not something that they would want to continue with. And like you were saying before, I think there is quite a lot of public support for banning this. You know, in general, the public tend to be sort of, you know, there's quite a lot of support for kind of animal friendly policies in a lot of ways. And I think, you know, this is not something that is, trophy hunting is the preserve of people with a lot of money. It's not something that's being widely done. It's not something that's easy to do in this country. Like, you know, issues like stalking of stags and that sort of thing is very expensive and quite unusual, you know. So I don't think that there's many votes to be won in the broader public in preserving trophy hunting. So it's not something that I've heard Labour talk a lot about, but, you know, they're still kind of only doing the broad brush outlines of their manifesto at the moment. Yeah. So, you know, hopefully if we can kind of keep the pressure up on, you know, keep talking about issues like this, just remind Labour that, you know, it's something that people feel pretty strongly about.
Yeah, a bit like fox hunting, really. The people who wanted to do that and who didn't want to have the ban were not the ones who had the most votes in the process. But, you know, of course, Keir hasn't had his first invite to Balmoral yet, where they often do a bit of stalking. So maybe that will they'll be seeking to change his mind if he does go there. Who knows? But so where this is happening are the national parks in Norway. And one of them, where they've been targeting this sale, and one of them has been closed to hunting for the past 8 years, presumably as a way of protecting this last wild herd of reindeer. It was difficult to get to anyway, they're very remote places. But it seems that this hunting firm has been given an official license by those parks to take out a small number of large males over a fairly short space of time. Now, presumably, Lizzie, the park authorities, which have protected them up to now, would say, well, look, the herds have got too big. They need to be culled slightly. Why don't we sell a license and get some funds out of that as well? But lots of this money, just like I said, doesn't go to the local area. They pay for the license to do the hunting, but then they charge thousands and thousands and thousands more, which has got nothing to do with any local economies, any of the native people who are there, who are trying to make livings in the same area, or perhaps are even looking after reindeer, who knows? And if they keep on doing these kind of slaughters, then that sort of creates the market in a way. Whereas if you ban the slaughters, which of course, if we were still part of the EU, we might have some kind of a say in. If you can ban anything about that slaughter, whether it's bringing in the trophies afterwards or banning the slaughters or somehow just decreasing the market, then surely you've done something that's for the best, one would have thought, not just for voters, but, you know, for the population, for the environment. For if this is the last wild reindeer in the world and all we're going to be left with after this are captive herds that are farmed, I can't understand why anybody wouldn't want to keep them utterly protected. And I know the hunters sit there and argue, don't they, that hunting them is a form of protection. I just don't buy that.
I think there'll always be people who argue that obviously you need to limit the numbers of, you know, in this case, reindeer, but, you know, it's been argued in the past about foxes, all that sort of thing. And then people will argue, well, if we've got to do that, why shouldn't people be allowed to have fun whilst doing it? But I think you could look at it in a different way and say that if, you know, by selling this license and allowing like foreign tourists to come over and do this, you are creating a market for it. Whereas if, you know, the culling is done locally and it's done, you know, not as part of a kind of like tourist trade, it creates different incentives for it. You know, this is obviously, yes, they might say, well, this is necessary, so we'll just sell the license. But, you know, that creates an appetite for people to come and do this for fun rather than for any kind of environmental or conservation reason, all of which could be argued, you know, you can argue that there are different ways of doing that anyway. But, I think it's quite hard to defend as a hobby or, something that firms should be selling, really.
It does seem rather tasteless and also unproductive. And they talk about, when they talk about fox hunting being banned, they said, well, it's a way of controlling the fox population. The minute you kill a fox, another 10 foxes move into the area to fight over the territory. So, and there's more foxes killed on the roads every year than there are by fox hunting. So none of it made any sense when they started arguing about that. And I'm sure a lot of the arguments to do with trophy hunting are pretty much the same. I've seen trophy hunters knocking around in Africa and stuff, and I've been on jobs, and they do not spend money in the local economy. It does not go anywhere locally whatsoever. Now, we need to turn to the main story of the day, which is pandemic profiteer Michelle Mone, who is subject of a police investigation and a paid-for interview where she pleaded innocence but got a lot of backlash for that. She's now been forced to do an interview with the BBC's Laura Kuenssberg, in which she made some fairly shocking admissions. Now, for legal reasons, we are not able to play you the full clip, but she basically said to Laura Kuenssberg that we didn't do anything wrong, Laura. I don't see what we did wrong. We just lied to the press. I don't see what's wrong about that. Lizzie, for the benefit of the tape then, can you tell us what Michelle Mone did wrong? Or can you tell Michelle if she's listening to this?
Yeah, it was, an absolutely extraordinary interview. The first time that Michelle Mone and her husband, Doug Barrowman, have spoken kind of publicly about this row. So, the basic background being that this is all about COVID contracts from 2020. So there's a firm called PPE MedPro that the Mirror and a number of other newspapers have been looking into for quite a long time now. And it won more than £200 million of contracts to deliver PPE to the NHS, government contracts to deliver PPE. And Michelle Mone and her husband have for a long time denied that they had any involvement in it, but have finally basically come clean and said Michelle Mone's husband, Doug Barrowman, led a consortium of firms behind PPE MedPro. So after a long time of denying that, saying they're not involved in any way, they finally came out and said, yeah, actually, we were involved. And Michelle Mone has said that, she did use her kind of contacts and her links with government. She's been a Conservative peer since 2015. She claimed that she rang up Michael Gove, who was the minister in charge of the Cabinet Office at the time, and said, I want to help during the pandemic, because you remember at the start in the early days of 2020, there was a desperate scramble to get enough PPE. There wasn't enough PPE in this country. And, the government was trying really hard to get businesses to get everything set up so that the NHS would have enough to cope. And Michelle Mone said that she, like many others, came forward and said, how can I help? I've worked in manufacturing for a long time. I've got contacts, I can help. But obviously not everybody is able to ring up a cabinet minister to make that kind of approach. No. And again, for a long time, she denied, and her husband denied that they benefited in any way from this deal. But yesterday, during this interview with the BBC, she was finally sort of forced to concede that she would benefit from this deal, which made something like 60 million in profit, because obviously her husband is involved in the firm, and if her husband died, obviously she would be entitled to the profits from this deal, as would the rest of her family, unless they made a big point of saying, well, if we get divorced, or he writes me out of his will or something like that. But it was a big development that this was the first time she'd really admitted that there was that link and that there was a chance that she could benefit from it. And this is a big sort of, there's a lot going on here. So the National Crime Agency is looking into the deal. The Department of Health and Social Care is involved in civil litigation with PPE MedPro, because they say that some of the gowns we've delivered were faulty, which is something that PPE MedPro denies. And Michelle Mone is also being investigated by the House of Lords for the fact that she failed to declare this interest, which peers and MPs are supposed to do. So it's quite complicated. There's quite a lot going on. But what was so interesting was in her interview, she basically said, the only thing I did wrong was lie to journalists about it. Which
okay. Does the NCA normally investigate people who lie to journalists? No. Does the House of Lords investigate people who lie to journalists? No. Does the High Court and start civil litigation and stuff just because people have lied? No. Those things only happen because you've lied to more people than just the journalists, usually.
Also,
sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, also, I always think this is a strange thing because lying to journalists is lying to the public. Like, it's not like you tell us things and it's just for our benefit. The journalists who've been working on this story for a really long time are doing it because there's a significant public interest in the contracts that were handed out during the pandemic, because it's taxpayers' money. And so it's not just lying to journalists. You're lying to the public if you're lying to journalists.
Yes, exactly. James says, if lying to the press is to be condemned, then surely the press lying to the public should also be condemned. Yes, of course it should, James. Mike says, someone sending threatening lawyers' letters to press organisations containing lies should be subject to prosecution. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a reverse libel law, because that's the other thing that Michelle Mone and her husband did. They didn't just deny the truth. They actually got their lawyers on to pressure the journalists to stop talking about it and to threaten them with legal action. Katrin says, I can't understand why the BBC did this when there's an ongoing investigation. It is a little bit sticky for contempt reasons, I would suggest, but they seem to have found a way through it for the lawyers. On Twitter, Bill says, as a member of the press, you can believe everything we say to you, Laura. But yes, we do tell lies to the press. Sort of astonishing. Harry says there should result in jail time for those who enabled her. It's worse than the expenses scandal. Unhappy Chappie says, as unpalatable as Mone and her husband are, they aren't the only ones involved in this great Tory scam. They're just the glam tip of the iceberg. Deal with them by all means, but don't let them be the scapegoats. Make the others accountable too, like Johnson, Gove, Sunak included. And that's part of the issue here. Is the reason we needed this PPE in a desperate rush, and there were billions of pounds that we didn't actually have being thrown at it, and lots of PPE, therefore, that wasn't up to spec when it came through, was because we'd had a PPE stockpile. And under previous Conservative governments, I think when Jeremy Hunt was the health secretary, they didn't renew it. And so it went to waste in a warehouse somewhere. And when they did finally need it for a pandemic, they found that it was no good anymore. They suddenly needed to order some more. At just the same point, the rest of the world was also ordering PPE in a hurry. We had nurses wearing bin bags to work, dealing with a highly infectious disease in its early stages. And so then suddenly you've got this urge, this need, and amazingly, it's the Tories and their mates again who seem to cash in and benefit, and they ring each other up and say, oh, I can get you some, I can get you some. It's going to be a cost a bit more, though. And you've got £200 million of PPE via PPE MedPro, some of which allegedly wasn't sterile and therefore wasn't usable. And Michelle Mone and her husband take 60 mil profit. 60 mil. Right? That is astonishing. That's a 30% profit margin on something, which just shows how much they were profiteering. Okay? Because if they were just doing it for the country and to help out, oh, we got a problem, let me find you some PPE, they'd do it at cost, wouldn't they? Or they'd do it for a very small profit. If they're sticking 60 million on top of the cost, then the worst thing they did was not just lie to the press. It was take 60 million off the taxpayer. And as you said, Lizzie, quite rightly, if you lie to the Mirror, you lie to the Mirror's readers. If you lie to the Mirror's readers, you're lying to the taxpayer whose 60 million it is that went into your pockets. A large chunk of it in this family trust for Michelle and her kids, which she denied even existed. She lied to the press, she lied to the public, she lied to the taxpayer. And I do hope she's not also lying to the police, because they tend to take that a bit harder than we do. Now, Lizzie, what's the timescale here? What are the likely developments going to be, especially with that National Crime Agency investigation? Do you have any indication when that she will be exonerated, of course, and allowed to go about her business? Because she did nothing wrong, remember?
Yeah, I mean, it is important to say, obviously, that Baroness Mone and her husband deny any wrongdoing. And, they've admitted that that they lied basically to the press about their involvement but they deny any wrongdoing, and they also deny that they breached the contract in any way. They say that the gowns that they provided for the Department of Health were, up to spec as discussed. So that there's a case going on at the moment between the Department of Health and the company about breach of contract, basically. The National Crime Agency is harder to tell. They have not provided, they don't really tend to provide information about their ongoing investigations, and I've got no sense at the moment about what the kind of timescale could be on that. Obviously, that is going to be that's a very tricky thing. The National Crime Agency will take quite a dim view on any suggestion that there's been anything misleading going on. So, I think Baroness Mone and her husband are clearly, they say that they've been scapegoated, that they are, that they didn't do anything wrong, that they were trying to help at a time when the government was asking for help with manufacturing PPE. The country was in sort of wartime scenario, that they were trying to help out and share their expertise. And lots of other people did come forward around this time as well. And there's been some controversy about that, because obviously when government contracts and all of this kind of thing normally go through quite a strict process to ensure that this sort of appearances of conflicts of interest or wrongdoing don't happen, that people aren't able to lobby ministers for things that benefit them. And, obviously the Baroness Mone denies that, but you can't argue that there is a perception that has developed that this did benefit them, that she was able to ring up Michael Gove, say, look, I can help you out, and put the government in touch with a firm that was run by a consortium run by her husband, which they then profited out of. And so, there may have been, they say that they did everything right, but there is certainly that perception there, which is a problem for them. And you can see that they've clearly decided to mount this, what they're calling a fight back. So they took part in a YouTube documentary quite recently, which is alleged to have been funded by PP MedPro, where they sort of spoke for the first time about a lot of this stuff. And then they gave this big box office interview to Laura Kuenssberg to try and get their side across. I don't know whether it's hard to say whether it was really successful. I mean, there were a lot of comparisons yesterday between this interview and the one that Prince Andrew did with Newsnight, famously. I don't know whether they'll feel that they've really, that it's really helped their case or not, but they wanted the opportunity to tell their side of the story, so they were given it. And now, they'll clearly try and, they're trying to sort of salvage their reputations and trying to win this sort of air war, basically.
Just like Prince Andrew, they'll probably think it went absolutely marvellously, especially if they think they didn't do anything wrong. Now, what do you think, everybody? Do you think Michelle Mone's interview has shown her to be a reasonable person, that it's absolutely fine to lie to the Mirror and its readers? Shona says Mone and her husband should be jailed and the money taken back. It does seem that, generally speaking, the public, at least the public that wishes to comment about it, doesn't feel too chuffed about Michelle Mone. I think generally, she is obviously not scapegoated, but being targeted a bit because she's a figure, because she's fairly well known, because lots of people have got her bras, and because she was a Tory peer as well, which of course makes it slightly more of a hook, I suppose, to hang it on, that she's personally profited by millions and millions and millions of pounds from the pandemic, which killed so many people. It's going to make a lot of those who suffered in the pandemic, whether it was from being locked down or whether it was from working in the NHS, whether it was without proper PPE, or whether it was just someone who felt they were being taxed too highly, they're all going to feel they've got some kind of grievance against her and that she's somehow responsible for any of that. Now, she's had to take, as you said, Lizzie, leave of absence from the House of Lords, which is a bit of a joke because since 2016, she's only made 5 speeches. She's voted about 280 odd times, but very interestingly, she's only made 22 written questions, the last one of which in 2020, get this, was to ask the Department of Health what it was doing about how to support its employees to be healthier while they're at work. Give them PPE, maybe? Stuff that works? Who knows? she's had to admit that she doesn't put her stake in PPE MedPro into the register of interest. And she says she doesn't realise that she had to do that. Astonishing. A stake in multi-million pound family trust, tens of millions of pounds. Who'll notice? What does that matter? What difference does it make to anybody, Lizzie? Why should a peer or anyone else in Parliament have to write down that they have an interest in millions and millions and millions of pounds somewhere piled up? What difference does that make?
I think it's really important that people do that. And I think in this case specifically, it's another example of the fact that MPs and peers are also expected to declare the interests of their partners and their families. You know, like Rishi Sunak has come a cropper with this as well, because, you know, he got into hot water earlier in this year, God, time is flying, when he failed to declare that his wife, who had an interest in a childcare firm that benefited from the budget, and, you know, he should have declared that interest on his register, which he didn't. And, you know, all ministers and, you know, MPs are always required to sort of explain whether their husband works for some sort of like sugar firm or for the oil and gas industry or whatever, if it's relevant to what they're doing, because to avoid this sort of thing. So Baroness Mone, you know, their argument is that she didn't have a direct stake in the firm, that you know, it was her husband's, you know, was leading this consortium. She had nothing to do with it. It's
well, then why was she ringing up, flogging it? Why? If it's nothing to do with her.
That's the point, you know, is that she says she didn't declare it because it's not her money, but the House of Lords, you know, would take pretty dim view on that, I think, because they'd be like, it's your husband's money, it's entirely relevant to this.
Yeah, and if you get divorced, it'll be your money too. So
yeah, exactly. So, you know, this is where I think they're really going to struggle here, because they've had to admit that they were involved, that the husband was involved, and she hasn't said in her interest that this was related to her, and she should have done, really.
Yeah. Well, what do you think, everybody? Do you think Michelle Mone should have her title revoked? Do you think she should be out of the House of Lords? Or do you think someone with that kind of business experience, who has the ability to ring up a minister and say, do this, do that, maybe they're useful in public life? Maybe there is a benefit to it some way. If you can think of one, do please write it on the back of a postcard and let us know. Dennis says, how many teachers can you employ for 60 million? I don't know, but you can build about 6 schools. So there's probably quite a lot of teachers you could get for that too. She's also had to admit that, yes, her husband was involved in this firm. Yes, they profited. Yes, the cash is in a family trust. But her husband, Doug Barrowman, appears to have been very opaque with the authorities about who was running PPE MedPro ultimately, because it was quite difficult. Maureen says he's another profiteer from the misery of ordinary people. But normally when someone runs a company, they have to register all their details with Companies House. They're legally required to do that. If you are incredibly famous and you are worried about press intrusion, you can let them use the address of your accountants and things like that. But you still have to give everyone your details that you are the one behind that firm. And it was quite difficult for journalists to actually link Barrowman to this because of the consortium of companies that were actually behind it. It had been set up to be quite difficult to trace the ownership of that company and the ultimate beneficiaries of it. It was intended to be difficult to find that out. Mone and her husband say, well, that's because the press is so nasty and terrible and everything else. Someone else might say, well, that's because you didn't want to be found out from the beginning, isn't it? But not perhaps being completely honest with people other than the press, for example, with the authorities and Companies House and stuff like that. That's going to get them in hot water as well, isn't it, Lizzie?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, that it's not a crime to have opaque structures.
No.
But, you know, this is why it's taken so long to kind of establish their involvement, because there was such a complicated setup of the kind of consortium behind PPE MedPro. So, you know, I think that's also something they'll probably have to explain. There may be very legitimate reasons for it, but I think there's been a lot, you know, this has been something that has been rumbling for quite a long time now. And it does seem like we're finally starting to get some answers. So I suspect the National Crime Agency will be able to get all the answers it needs, and it will be much easier for them to ask questions than it has been for the media, who've been repeatedly stonewalled on this.
Yes, and you can't say the only thing we did wrong was lie to the National Crime Agency, because that's not going to wash.
No, and it's a crime to lie. Yes. So I think that's something that hopefully we'll get some more answers on. But they're in a tricky spot, because you've got this National Crime Agency, you've got the civil case against the Department of Health, and an investigation in the House of Lords. So I mean, it's like it's everywhere they turn now. There are challenges everywhere. So, hence the fact that I think they're coming out like this at this point, because clearly they're running out of options.
Yeah. Well, we will have a lot of sympathy for Michelle Mone and her husband, I'm sure. Is there any way that if she is found to have done more wrong than we've already managed to prove that she's done, that she could be stripped of her title? She's not exactly an adornment to the House of Lords, it would appear.
I mean, it is possible. It's quite unusual, but
I think Jeffrey Archer's still in there, isn't he?
Yeah, it has happened before. So I think if any of either the National Crime Agency investigation or the court case finds against her in some specific way, I think there probably would be an appetite in the Lords for that to happen, because other peers will think that it is damaging to the reputation of the House, and I think the government will probably take quite a dim view of it as well, considering the Department of Health is in court with this firm.
Yeah, that's probably not great. But I would suggest that Evgeny Lebedev and Jeffrey Archer and a few other people probably aren't making the House of Lords look good either, and they still seem to be sat there. We have to wait and see, won't we, what pans out there. Well, obviously, we all wish the absolute best for Michelle Mone and her husband over the festive season. I do hope she doesn't find anything too stressful. If she does, she can at least count the millions, which should make it feel a little bit better for her. Unfortunately, the taxpayer doesn't have those millions to count anymore. Right, thank you for that, Lizzie. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. We have managed to find some good news for you to wrap up the final news agenda of 2023, and here it is. Now, just in case if you were wondering whether Santa will be making it down the chimney this year, what with the potholes and the NHS crisis and the freak weather patterns and the actual slaughter of reindeer that's going on, we have some good news for you. His load is going to be lifted considerably with the help of Ray Hulse, 79, from Bridgnorth in Shropshire, who will be putting on Santa's spare red suit to give out gifts for local children, just as he has since 1962, when he was just 18. Now, Ray has handed out more than 7,000 presents and spent 3,000 hours dressed as Santa to help the big man out, and is doing it again this year, even though he collapsed with sepsis back in the summer and spent 3 months in intensive care. Right now, Lizzie, is this proof that so long as you're good and you're not on the naughty list, like Michelle Mone probably, maybe, Santa is always going to be there for you and will turn up?
Oh, this is such a great story. I love the fact that he's been a Santa since he was 18. This is lovely. And what an amazing level of commitment to do that for so long. 61, was it 61 consecutive Christmases? Yeah, I mean, it's very obviously it's very nice that kind of he's wanted to do that, and he's given so much of his time for so long to do that. So I think a rare bit of good news, which is very nice, and we'll wish him all the best.
Someone offering to help out the authorities, right, the Father Christmas authorities, because they're busy and not in order to line his own pocket. Isn't that wonderful? What the festive season is really all about. Thank you very much, Lizzie, for taking us through all this stuff today. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. And Michelle Mone would like to thank you all for paying your taxes as well. We will see you again in the new year. We're not back until January the 8th, when hopefully there'll be some news of some sort over the Christmas break. But obviously the Mirror will still be being published every day, apart from Christmas Day. Journalists will be at work on Christmas Day. There'll probably be a coach crash because there usually is. Avoid coaches at this time of year, everybody. I hope you've all been good, and I hope Santa brings you something lovely. And we will see you all again on January the 8th, I think it is. And until then, everybody, stay safe, stay out of coach trips, and we'll see you on the other side, all right, in 2024. Good Lord, what a year it's been. Maybe we'll have a general election next year, a new government, the same government. Who knows? It's all there to argue about, isn't it? Thank you again, Lizzie, and thank you, everybody else, and we'll see you on the other side. Until then, tatty bye.